Near a small Belgian village called Chelles, about 50 Sherman tanks did something most German officers thought was impossible in the winter of 1944. In roughly 3 hours, they stopped the last serious German armored push in the west and cut the Spearhead of Second Panzer Division to pieces. To see how that could happen in one cold valley, we need to wind the clock back 8 days, to the early hours of 16 December 1944. The Ardennes forest was supposed to be a quiet sector for worn-out American infantry. Instead, along roughly 80 miles of front, about 1,400 German guns opened up in the dark. Shells crashed into foxholes, dugouts, and thin command posts that were never built for a major attack. Behind that barrage waited the tanks of Colonel Meinrad von Lauchert and his Second Panzer Division. On paper, they were part of a heavy punch force. 3 German armies, more than 200,000 men, had been lined up behind a simple plan. Hit the weak American line. Reach the Meuse River. Grab the bridges near places like Dinant before the engineers could blow them, then roll on toward Antwerp. If that armoured column reached the Meuse in strength, the Allied front in the west would start to come apart. There was one problem sitting in the background of every order they received, and it started long before the first shell hit the line. Germany's synthetic fuel plants at Luna, Pölitz, and other sites had been pounded for months by American bombers. Stocks were low, production was erratic, and every armoured move now came with an accountant's ledger attached. The planners for the Ardennes were counting on fixing that in the field by seizing American fuel dumps as they went. That assumption would kill Second Panzer Division, and it is important to understand what kind of unit was gambling on it. Locher's division was not a ragged collection of boys and older men. It still had a hard core of veterans who had survived years of fighting on the Eastern Front and then Normandy. Many of the Panther crews had learned to read a battlefield in Russia where being slow or sloppy meant a T-34 shell in your flank. They knew how to move fast, how to exploit a gap, how to push on while the enemy was still trying to figure out what was happening. The Panther tank they drove looked like the perfect tool for this last gamble. It carried a 75mm high-velocity gun that could punch through the front of a Sherman at well over 1,000 yards. Its sloped front armor had given Soviet crews nightmares. German optics were excellent. On open ground, at long range, it was a very dangerous vehicle. But every one of those Panthers burned fuel at a frightening rate. Roughly 1.5 gallons for every mile over those Ardennes roads. And most of the roads ahead of Second Panzer were narrow, twisting country lanes through woods, not smooth highways. So the entire operation became a race between the frontline tanks and the fuel columns struggling along behind them. At first, it seemed to work. In the first 48 hours, American units gave way in confusion. Communications broke down. Some companies found themselves outflanked before they even understood a major offensive had begun. By 18 December, elements of Second Panzer had already pushed tens of miles to the west, deeper into Belgium than Allied intelligence thought possible in that terrain and that weather. They bypassed Bastogne rather than waste time in heavy street fighting, leaving that problem to other formations and angled northwest toward the Meuse crossings. From the perspective of many German officers, this looked a lot like the opening days of 1940 all over again. Thin Allied defenses, surprise, and a fast armoured drive through the Ardennes. But there were 2 crucial differences that Christmas. The first difference was invisible from the turret of a tank. As Kampfgruppe Piper from 1st SS Panzer Division lunged towards Stavelot, it expected to find a massive American fuel depot waiting to be captured. Engineers on the German staff had already penciled that fuel into their planning figures. Instead, Piper's men found empty storage tanks and puddles of burning gasoline. American engineers had blown or drained the depot hours earlier. Across the sector, engineers and ordnance troops did the same thing. Fuel stocks were removed, destroyed, or pumped into any vehicle that could move before the Germans arrived. To the tank crews at the front, this looked like bad luck. In reality, it was deliberate policy. The Americans understood that their fuel was more valuable than terrain. The second difference hung above the forest. The German plan depended on bad weather. Low cloud and fog had grounded Allied air power for much of December. That helped the initial attack tremendously. For several days, German columns moved without seeing a single American fighter bomber. Then, on 23 December, the cloud ceiling lifted. Within hours, aircraft from the 9th Air Force Tactical Commands and other Allied units swarmed over the road net feeding the German Spearheads. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, sturdy fighter bombers that could carry bombs and rockets as well as machine guns, spent the next days looking for one thing: trucks. They did not care whether those trucks carried infantry, ammunition, or fuel. If it moved on a road running toward the front, someone in an American cockpit would take a shot at it. A German driver creeping along a forest lane suddenly found himself under a diving roar. Then there were rockets, fire, and burning gasoline. When a fuel column goes up like that in a confined road, everything behind it stops. Locha's supply battalions were caught in that storm just like everyone else. On his situation maps, the division still looked solid. In the real world, the forward tank battalions were slowly outrunning the fuel that kept them alive. While this was happening, the Americans were quietly building the trap at the far end of that road. On the Allied side of the lines, tankers of Second Armored Division were supposed to be resting and refitting. The division had already fought its way from North Africa through Sicily and Normandy. It had crossed France at high speed in the summer. Its nickname, Hell on Wheels, was not just a bit of paint on a unit sign. It reflected a particular style of fighting: aggressive, mobile, and very comfortable with large-scale armored counterattacks. Major General Ernest Harmon, its commander, was not a theorist. He was a practical armored leader who expected his officers to move fast, coordinate with artillery and air support, and keep pressure on the enemy. On 24 December, he received orders that boiled down to one line. A German armored Spearhead was sitting near Celle, only a few miles from the Meuse. Second Armored Division was to stop it. This was not a desperate last stand. The Americans had bridges, fuel dumps, and large truck parks sitting just behind the river. They had fresh ammunition stocks waiting on hard standing. Their columns drove west and then south towards Celles along intact roads under friendly aircraft, guided by radio traffic that was never more than a few minutes out of date. That contrast is worth holding in your mind. On one side, Panther tanks idling to conserve their last fuel, waiting for trucks that might never arrive. On the other side, a division that could top up its tanks, change a damaged track, and still have time to brew coffee before rolling out. Now, we come back to Celles. On the German situation maps, the village was not remarkable. A small Belgian settlement in a valley near Dinant. In reality, it became the high point of the entire offensive. By the night of 24 December, Kampfgruppe von Koschenhausen, the spearhead of Second Panzer Division, had pushed as far as any German unit would reach in the west during the Ardennes fighting. Roughly 40 Panthers and Panzer IVs, plus supporting infantry and assault guns, were assembled near Celle. They could look out toward the Meuse Valley from nearby ridges. The river itself lay only a handful of kilometers away, but the fuel reports were brutal. Many of those vehicles carried barely enough petrol to move 8 or 10 kilometers over hilly terrain. That meant they might be able to rush to the river line, but not maneuver in any serious fight, and certainly not carry on toward Antwerp. Behind them, the rest of Second Panzer Division was stretched out in a long, vulnerable column through the forest. Wrecked trucks and burned fuel bowsers marked the places where Allied fighter bombers had already found them. Locha understood this even before the American tanks appeared. His staff officers knew what their fuel ledger looked like. They also knew what orders they had received. The Spearhead was to hold where it was and be ready to push on if fuel arrived. It never did. On Christmas morning, while local Belgian families tried to celebrate in cellars and barns, American armored columns began to close in. Second Armored Division did not arrive as one neat parade. It came in the form that modern armored warfare prefers: combat commands. Mixed groups of tank battalions, armored infantry, and attached artillery approached from different directions. One element pushed from the north, another from the east. Smaller forces probed from other roads and tracks. Sherman tanks from the 66th and 67th Armored Regiments led the way in many of these thrusts. Most of them were the standard 75mm gun model that German crews mocked as a Ronson, after the cigarette lighter. They knew that if a Panther managed to put a round into the right place, a Sherman could burn quickly. Harmon and his regimental commanders had no intention of offering that kind of shot. Instead of charging straight down the main road into the teeth of prepared German guns, American platoons used the folds of the ground and the patches of woodland. They eased forward along concealed approaches, halting to fire from hull-down positions, then shifting again before German gunners could walk their fire onto them. The key was not a single daring maneuver. It was coordination. Forward observers with radios rode close to the front. Within minutes, they could attach grid coordinates to any German muzzle flash or movement. Artillery battalions, sitting miles to the rear with full ammunition stocks, would respond with timed concentrations. At the same time, liaison officers worked with the tactical air units overhead so that P-47 pilots had updated information on where German armor and transport were massed. From the German side, the effect felt like being hit by every branch of the enemy force at once. Panthers near Keles were already short of fuel. They could still traverse their turrets and fire, but they could not keep relocating indefinitely. Every long sprint risked leaving a tank dry in a bad position. As American pressure increased, many were forced into static hull, down sights, or into short dashes between farm buildings and hedgerows. In those conditions, some of the Panther's advantages started to erode. Yes, its frontal armor remained difficult for a Sherman 75mm gun to penetrate at range. But a Sherman platoon that managed to get into a flank position, even at shorter distances, could knock out a Panther by hitting suspension, tracks, or thinner side armor. And they had something the Germans increasingly did not have: choice. If one tank was hit, another could replace it. If a platoon took losses, a reserve unit could be fed in. Tanks could withdraw to replenish ammunition and fuel, then return. By late morning, the fighting around Celles had settled into a grim pattern. German tanks knocked out some Shermans. American artillery and airstrikes set Panthers and half-tracks on fire. The ring around the village tightened. Lieutenant Colonel Hugh O'Farrell, commanding a task force from Second Armored Division, later reported that his regiment alone accounted for dozens of German armored vehicles in that small pocket, including Panthers, Panzer IVs, and self-propelled guns. Across the division, at least 50 Sherman tanks from several companies took part directly in the engagement around Celles, supported by many more in the wider encirclement. Think through those proportions for a moment. A German Spearhead that had started the day with roughly 40 operational tanks found itself attacked from several directions by a force that could put at least that many Shermans into the immediate fight and still hold more in reserve on the edges of the pocket. At the same time, fighter bombers circled above like a second ring of steel. Any attempt by German vehicles to break cover and rush the American lines risked drawing rockets and bombs as well as tank fire. By early afternoon, Lauscher, watching from a command post east of the main fight, listened to his radio net begin to fracture. Company commanders were reporting tanks disabled for lack of fuel, others immobilized by track hits, more knocked out entirely. Some infantry platoons were already trying to slip away on foot through the woods. The numbers were sliding out of his control. After the war, American analysts loved to compare tank-kill ratios. They noted that in many individual duels, a Panther could destroy several Shermans before being lost itself. What Celles showed in a brutally compressed few hours was how little that mattered once you expanded the frame. By late 1944, American industry was producing roughly 2,000 Sherman tanks every month. German factories, disrupted by bombing and shortages, were turning out a few hundred Panthers in the same period, plus smaller numbers of Panzer IVs and other vehicles. The United States had millions of trucks shuttling supplies across the European theater. Germany still relied heavily on horse-drawn wagons. So, when Second Armored Division committed around 50 Shermans against the Celles pocket, with more in supporting distance, it was not taking an insane gamble. It was spending from a deep account. Lauscher understood that instinctively when he raised his field glasses and saw line after line of American tanks edging out of the tree line. Not one platoon that he could smash and scatter with a counterattack, but waves of armor that kept appearing even as others burned. By mid-afternoon, the Kampfgruppe in Keles was no longer a coherent formation. Individual crews fought local battles from burning farmyards and ditches. Some Panthers held on until they ran out of both ammunition and fuel. In a few cases, crews set demolition charges on their own tanks rather than see them captured. Others simply abandoned vehicles that had thrown tracks or suffered minor damage but could no longer move in the face of American fire. From Lauscher's perspective, the choice narrowed to two options: Either leave his spearhead to be annihilated in place, or risk a breakout with whatever could still move. He chose the second. Orders went out over the net. Any vehicle that still had enough fuel to move would assemble for an attempt to slip southeast through the tightening American ring. Everything else was to be destroyed. Thermite grenades were dropped into engine compartments. Charges were set under breech blocks. Important documents were burned. It was a cold, methodical act. Not a dramatic last stand, but a staff officer's acceptance that the division's best equipment and crews were about to be written off. When the breakout attempt finally went in, only a handful of Panthers and other vehicles managed to fight their way clear. By the time Leuchert reached more secure German lines that night, he had saved perhaps 4 operational tanks and a small fraction of the 800 men who had started the Spearhead days earlier. The pocket around Chelles was left littered with metal. American after-action reports counted around 80 German armored vehicles destroyed or captured in that small area. Hundreds of German soldiers were taken prisoner. Others disappeared into the winter woods and tried to find their way back on foot. The village itself marked the furthest west any German armored unit reached in the Ardennes offensive. From a purely tactical point of view, it looked like a textbook American combined arms victory. Well-handled tanks, strong artillery support, tight coordination with air power, adequate logistics. From the German perspective, it felt like something else. A week later, Leuchert found himself summoned to the headquarters of Field Marshal Walter Model, the man the German army used as a troubleshooter whenever a front was in crisis. Model's command post in the Ardennes was dug into a concrete shelter full of radio traffic and harried staff officers. When Leuchert was shown in, the Field Marshal did not waste time on formality. He had already read the written report on Second Panzer Division's losses. He asked only a few questions. Could the Panthers destroy Shermans when they met them on anything like equal terms? Yes, Leuchert replied. At Celle, despite their problems, his tanks had knocked out a significant number of American vehicles before being overwhelmed. Model nodded. Then he pointed at the map. And they kept coming, he said. It was not framed as a criticism. It was an observation. During the first week of the Ardennes offensive, German units had destroyed hundreds of Allied tanks across the front. Yet intelligence now indicated that American armored strength in the sector was not dropping. In some areas, it was increasing as fresh units moved in. Model had built his reputation on moving the last reserves at the right time and place to stabilize a collapsing line. In the Ardennes, there were no real reserves left to move. The panzer divisions he had committed were his last mobile asset in the west. Second Panzer's Spearhead had been spent at Celle. Other divisions had bled out around Bastogne and on the approaches to Saint-Vith. The Field Marshal could not conjure new tanks out of ruined factories. By mid-January 1945, German reports showed that the major panzer divisions engaged in the offensive had suffered vehicle losses of 50 to 60%. Many had also lost over a third of their trained crews and infantry. Meanwhile, American armor and artillery on the Western Front were being brought back to full strength in a matter of weeks. The deeper numbers were even more lopsided. In 1944 alone, American industry produced on the order of 17,500 tanks, many of them Shermans. Germany, under constant attack and short of materials, managed only a few thousand Panthers and roughly the same order of Panzer IVs across the year. American factories turned out close to 100,000 aircraft in that same period. German output was less than half that. On the ground, the United States employed more than 2 million trucks to haul supplies forward. German. Divisional histories from the Ardennes are full of references to horse teams, broken wagons, and fuel shortages. All of that meant that what happened at Celles was not a strange exception. It was a demonstration. If you look at the engagement strictly at the level of armor thickness and gun performance, you can write it as a story about brave crews in superior German tanks being ambushed by massed Shermans with air support. If you pull back to the level that Leuchert and Model were forced to see, it becomes something else. A modern war fought between industrial states is not decided by the single duel where one Panther kills 3 Shermans. It is decided by which side can lose 3 Shermans, replace them, and still have enough trucks, fuel, and trained crews to go back on the offensive. That is the realization Leuchert was groping toward when he answered the American interrogator in that post-war room. He was not saying that his crews were worse than their opponents. Many of them were experienced and tactically clever. He was not saying that the Panther was a bad tank. When it had fuel and a good crew in open country, it could be murderous. He was admitting that by the time his division reached Selles, those qualities could not compensate for the scale of American production and the system that supported it. The battle around that small Belgian village lasted only a few hours of intense fighting, followed by mopping up. It destroyed Second Panzer Division as an effective offensive formation. More importantly, it marked the outward limit of Germany's last attempt to change the war in the West by one bold stroke. When people talk about the Ardennes, they often focus on famous names like Bastogne, on paratroopers holding crossroads, on propaganda phrases about a last gamble. All of that matters. But if you want to understand why that gamble could never pay off, you study a frozen field near Celle, where roughly 50 Shermans went to work on a fuel-starved German Spearhead, and did exactly what their doctrine, their logistics, and their factories had prepared them to do. They did not win because they had the prettiest tank on the field. They won because every wrecked Sherman could be replaced, and every burned Panther was one step closer to an army that could no longer move. And once a mechanized army cannot move, it does not matter how brave its crews are or how thick the armor plate is on the last surviving tank. If you found this kind of breakdown useful, and you want more cases where one small battle reveals the real machinery behind the Second World War, tell me what front, what unit, or what forgotten action you want us to open up next. These stories are not just about steel and numbers. They are about how people, doctrines, and industries either learned in time or did not, because in places like Chelles, the learning came too late.